Greetings, 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 and welcome to day 24. We are moving right along, y'all. I can't believe this journey started February 1st, and here we are, February 24th, and still going strong. Fairly strong. Your girl is off camera again today. It's been a day. It has been a day. So I am practicing what I preach and taking care of myself by having an extra day, giving myself the gift of another day off camera. So thank you for your grace and having space for that. Yeah, I'm showing up, but man, showing up in the best way that I can. So this week is about sacred restoration. This final week, and lo and behold, your girl needs some restoration. But this week is about that, and today we are talking about and honoring Dr. Marimba Ani and Miriam Makeba. And as I have said every day of every aspect of this, if I mispronunciate anyone's name, I mean absolutely no disrespect. All praise and honor to these women and every other ancestor that we have honored and highlighted and brought forth their wisdom, and we give thanks. And these two women brought forth this concept of cultural reclamation, reclaiming our culture as a part of our path to restoring the sacred restoration that we all need, having endured oppression and specifically enslavement, but overall oppression through colonization, um, transatlantic slave trade, and racialized capitalism, we go on and on. But today we're talking about the work that they did and how we can learn from them and apply that wisdom in our lives today as a way of activating that wisdom. And that's what this whole 28 days has been about, activating the wisdom of our individual as well as our collective ancestors so that we can know how to navigate what's ahead of us, what we're in already. It's already begun. And so if that's your jam, like, subscribe, ring the bell so that you know when we go live. We do have a few more days of these live. And, in March, we go into Women's History Month. And you know how I cape for Black women. In fact, this channel is about and for Black women. My work, my books, this channel, my books, the work, the coaching that I do is for Black women to recognize that we're beautiful, remember that we are powerful, and to be loved, and all the things that that means. And there's a lot underneath that. And that's part of and at the core of what I do when I work with women one on one in my coaching program. You can find out more. There's links in the description, and I'll be sharing more about that as we go along as well in future videos. This video is about honoring our ancestors and tapping into that knowledge and wisdom. And one thing I will say, I had hoped and thought, rather, that I would continue with doing our ancestral guided meditations at the end of our session today, at the end of sharing the work and the wisdom of these two ancestors. But the direction, the clarity, the messages I got before coming on, because I always tap in and do all of my things in preparation, was to direct people to do their own research. So, for example, as we go into it, well, we'll get into it. I'll share what these two women have done, and you can find clips of them doing what they do on YouTube, online. And rather than me go through a guided meditation when my energy is already struggling today, the opportunity for you to go and find their words, the vibration of their voices directly, and hear and sit with that and meditate with that in yourself is far more powerful, because we're talking about more contemporary ancestors, so that their voices actually can be heard and were recorded. So with that, let's get into it, y'all. I hope everyone is doing well. Hey, Power Dynamics. I'm not sure at what point you came in, but we're gonna get through today. No meditation at the end because your girl is struggling. It's been it's been a day. It's been a day, but we're getting into it and talking about cultural reclamation with these two esteemed ancestors. So we'll start with Dr. Marimba Ani. And as I said, if I am not saying that properly, give me grace. Give me grace. So she was born, actually, Donna Richards, in 1941 in New York. And, just like every other time period, but some more than others, there was a deep segregation and just racial oppression. Now, she was born just after the Harlem Renaissance, but that energy and that cultural influence could still be felt where she was and where she grew up. And there was a lot of contradictions, as we know and as we still see, that she experienced herself between this idea of American democracy and what it was to be a Black American. And in her neighborhood in Harlem, she had a lot of, there was a lot of intellectual discourse and activism. Again, coming out of the Harlem Renaissance, there was a lot of the residue of that was still there. People still thought deeply and still held on to their culture and promoted their culture. And this whole idea of liberation was taking seed and expanding. And this all shaped her consciousness. Um, of course, she attended rallies and lectures. She got mentored, but that was the foundation in New York City, in Harlem, that she was born into. And again, coming through that Black liberation struggle, civil rights movement, she was in the core of it, and she was exposed to all kinds of, W.E.B. Du Bois, Langston Hughes. She was exposed to all of these thoughts at an early age and was involved and immersed in that. In fact, from 1963 to 68, she served as a field organizer for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. Now, you've heard me mention that throughout the last 3 weeks, mm, probably more so the last 2 weeks with sacred resistance, and then coming into this week. SNCC was a powerful force. So I will encourage you to go back to the video on Kwame Ture or Stokely Carmichael and Tupac. That was one of the places. Um, Mama Fannie Lou Hamer. The, either of those videos, we talked about it because this has been an organization that a lot of our resistance and clearly restoration ancestors were involved in. And she was Dr. Marimba Ani was in Mississippi, which again, as we've learned, was one of the most dangerous and pivotal regions for civil rights activism at the time. And in one of the harshest slave states, and is still a state that you want to be very clear about where you are. And she worked directly with Black communities that were experiencing this violence, and was definitely influenced by everything that she grew up around and was involved in. And she went on to pursue her her bachelor's degree, obviously, first of all, from the University of Chicago, and there she got exposure to um, these Western ideas and academic frameworks that made her want to challenge them and deconstruct them. It didn't sit right with who she was and how she had grown up and the things she had been involved in, to then get these Western ideas of what it meant to look at society, to look at how people related. She went on and got her MA and her PhD in anthropology at the New School for Social Research, where she focused on culture and systems of oppression and resistance. Sister girl did the thing. She said, I was born in this. I lived in this. This is my lived experience. I went and got a little bit an understanding of how the Western mindset thinks about this. I'm going to go deep and understand what this impact is on our people in a more direct way or in an academic way. And her research emphasized that we need to reclaim our African cultural values as a foundation for Black liberation. Again, we've been talking about that this whole almost month that we're headed towards completing the month. Part of our restoration, part of our resistance, part of what gives us the clarity and the cultural understanding of how to navigate all of the things, how to make decisions, all of that goes back to understanding truly who we are, our cultural context, how we view the world in a very different way than the ones who are running most of the world at this point. Later on, she adopted the name Marimba Ani from Donna Richards as a way to reject this Western imposed identity and to really affirm her African language. It was part of a broader commitment to Pan-Africanism and to her cultural sovereignty. She went in, and we give thanks. So that was her foundation of, um, the early life, her foundation in terms of the work that she would eventually do that we'll talk more about on as we go forward. But again, just wanted to give you that. So she was steeped in it. She lived in it. She got educated very deeply in it. This became who she was, or rather, it was who she was from Jump Street. She just followed it all the way through with her education and the work that she has contributed and left for us. So let's move on to Miriam Makeba. She was born, I'm not even going to try to say her first name, or maybe I should try. I'll give it an effort. Zenzeli. I did not research to really get my words correctly before this. Like I said, it's been a day. But we're going to go with it. Zenzeli Miriam Makeba. In March 1932 in Johannesburg, Prospect Township, South Africa. And this was during the height of the British colonial occupation. I need to change that influence. Let's call the thing a thing. It was the British occupation of that space. Now, her mother was a traditional healer, which is called a sangoma, and a domestic worker. And her father, between the two of them, they gave the strong cultural foundation that was rooted in her indigenous African identity. There was no, we're going to try to forget who we were so we can fit in to this regime. It said that at only 18 days old, just over 2 weeks old, she was imprisoned with her mother because of discriminatory past laws. So she wasn't even conscious of what was going on and was already experienced the impact of the oppression. Now she was raised in Sophiatown, which was a vibrant cultural hub, and actually was one of the places that was targeted by the colonial forces there, by the British. Now, Sophiatown is a place that was like, you could call it their Harlem. It was where there was music, there was dance, there was cultural expression, there was Black people being their beautiful blackety selves in full pride and all the aspects that make our culture what it is. Having grown up in that, that gave her this commitment to using music as a tool, which is what she did and what we'll talk about as we go forward. But let me take a step back and not under explain, explain a bit about apartheid. Um, hmm. It was an institutionalized racial segregation and discrimination system put in place by the colonial forces. Now that sounds lightweight, but it was brutal. There was strict racial hierarchy and privileges that the white majority held while they oppressed the Black majority. Let me say that again. Privilege that the white minority held while they oppressed the Black majority. And then colored mixed race or Indian populations were also oppressed. So a lot of the parts of that is that every South African was classified by race, by what they called race, white, Black, colored, or Indian. And rights and privileges were assigned based on that classification. The past laws that I just mentioned, like the one that caused Miriam's mother and herself at 18 days old, to be imprisoned, is that Black South Africans were required to carry passbooks at all times. Their movements were controlled and restricted. They were only allowed in designated areas unless they had permits. There was forced removals and resettlements of areas that forcibly removed non-white communities from areas that were designated for white populations. White people decided they wanted it. Y'all got to go. I don't care how long you've been there or what you think you own or have. Only white South Africans had full political rights. Black South Africans were denied the right to vote or to be represented in the government. Interracial relationships were banned. Black South Africans were exploited. They were restricted to low-paying jobs, and labor unions were heavily suppressed. There was inequality in education. There was widespread poverty. And of course, in response to that, there were many and a growth of anti-apartheid movements, international sanctions, boycotts. It was a thing. And if we look around at what's happening in the US right now, keeping in mind that the robot in office, who never got elected to office, but the robot that is in office is from South Africa. Is there a playbook being implemented? We would never know if we don't understand what's happened and understand what's happened globally, not only in this country, understand what's happened here, but what's happened in other parts of the world to people who look like us, to Black people, to anyone who isn't a white man. So I wanted to give that context of this is what she grew up in. This is what she was steeped in. Having been in Sophiatown where she got the rich culture, her parents taught her who she was very steeped in her African culture, but also saw what was happening to her African culture and to people and to her people. So, of course, having been in Sophiatown with all of the artists and, where the cool people were, until they decided to destroy it, her musical became evident, and she actually rose to fame during this time period of just intensified um, apartheid, repression, and oppression. She started her career singing with the Manhattan Brothers, and then she later formed the Skylarks, and she blended South African jazz with traditional melodies and gospel influences. She celebrated African culture despite the cultural suppression that was happening. She had a performance that was in the film Come Back Africa in 1959, and it highlighted the daily struggles of Black South Africans, and that led to her exile in 1960 after the South African government revoked her passport. So let's talk about that. 30 years she was exiled after this publicly condemning the apartheid or the practice of apartheid. And so this happened. She was traveling, living her life, doing what she does as a performer, and she tried to come back to home to South Africa for her mother's funeral. When she arrived, they said that her passport had been revoked and she was not allowed entry. So at this point, she has no nationality. She has no passport. She's what they call stateless. They also banned her music and viewed her influence and her activism as a threat. And by they, we're talking about the British. Now, because this is what Black women do, and this is transform. She was exiled. She transformed that into a global platform. Tell us we can't do something, we will find a way to do it and do it even better and look good doing it. So she turned that into a global platform. She relocated to the US. Harry Belafonte helped her to relocate and helped to elevate her career in activism. They actually later on did a song together, collaborated, and she won a Grammy Award in 1965, and she was the first African artist to receive a Grammy. And again, despite not having a quote unquote home, a place, a country that she could call home, She became the first African woman to address the United Nations in 1963, and she spoke about apartheid's human rights abuses and called for international sanctions. So she did this as a private citizen. She did this on her own. Now, later on, she ended up addressing the UN as an official delegate for Ghana. So she's, been there twice. Well, more than twice, because then she was a delegate. She was a part of it. But I wanted to just make those two distinctions is that she, without having the official title or the official role, she was using the platform that she had to do what she could in her music, in her work, in her being outspoken about what was going on. She did what she could and did what she did. She also married Kwame Ture, that Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture. And so when they got together in 1968, the U.S. government said, "Oh, hell no." It just made them, I mean, they were already under surveillance. They increased their surveillance. They folks was canceling her U.S. performances. They moved to Guinea, and that's how she got connected in from living in Guinea with the president, and the president who was part of the namesake that Kwame Ture took on. It was President Ahmed Sekou Toure. And he appointed her as their delegate to the United Nations. And she continued to speak globally about apartheid and African liberation as a whole, Pan Africanism as a whole. So the South African government and their um, desire to silence her, to exile her, ban her music, they actually just elevated her to a global stage to have an even bigger impact. So to their stupidity, we say thanks. And our hearts go to her. I'm sure her mother was proud, but I know she would have wanted to be there for her mother's funeral. But she did something for her mother that I'm sure, as an ancestor, she was rejoicing, and they're rejoicing together now. And then finally, in 1990, after the release of Nelson Mandela, he was able to return home. I'm sorry, I just got to pause for that because that emotional turmoil, that emotional arc of being exiled, not being able to go home, not being able to go to your mother's funeral, all of these things that she had to do, even coming to the United States and then having to leave there because of being targeted by the US government. So it's like the colonizer in one place kicked her out. She comes here, the colonizer here. They ain't kick her out, but she left to make sure she would live, her and Kwame Ture. And then to finally be able to return. That in and of itself is part of the legacy she leaves for us, the symbolism of that. But we'll talk about that. I just had to pause because the emotions in that, I felt that. So let's keep going. Um, yes, the Black news anchors getting fired left and right. And all of these things happening, same thing, trying to silence. I mean, and I'm gonna just keep it real, just personal stuff too. I mean, because we all trying to navigate that, our own lives, and then with the things happening. But I'm thankful for all of these ancestors. I'm thankful for Dr. Ani and Mama Makeba because it gives me the hope and it gives me something to pull on to keep going. Even if the keep going means take a break, take a pause, but not to give up hope, to understand, do what we need to do to take care of ourselves, to have the mental and physical health to move forward, but know that moving forward must happen. Fannie Lou said, I'd rather fall 5 feet 4 inches forward if I'm a fall, meaning keep moving forward, which is what we're going to do today, right now. And we're going to move forward. And so, what did they do? What were their contributions? Let's talk about that a little bit more specifically. So, Dr. Ani, she introduced this concept of ma'afa. Now, that's how I always say it. I don't know. I think I've heard people say it different ways, but I'm going to do what I know. And as a communications person, you would think I wouldn't struggle with words, but we are crossing all kinds of languages. We've been speaking French, uh, Twi, Yoruba, uh, was it some Spanish in there? Probably a little bit of Spanish. We've been all over the world with these words, so I'm giving myself grace on that. Anyway, we're going to keep going. I'm gonna stop bringing it up. So she introduced this concept of maafa, and which is Swahili for great disaster, and it was used, and she used it to describe the collective trauma of what we've experienced in the African diaspora, and it takes it beyond just the slave trade happened, slavery happened, and then it's over. It's looking at the entire tragedy that we're still living, that we're still experiencing, instead of looking at it as just slavery or the Middle Passage to describe historic events. It brings it current and it makes it understand the entire continuum of suffering and the psychological, spiritual, cultural, and economic devastation that was inflicted upon African people. Those of us in the diaspora, as well as those who have been colonized. Um, and again, it gives that holistic view and frames it in this idea of a cultural genocide. And I mentioned that a bit yesterday in terms of, or the days are blending in, whether different tribes, quote unquote, enslaved each other on the continent. It was nothing in comparison, not even a fraction of what this global slave trade has been. No one's culture, no one's family, no one's very identity was erased through those practices. Those were more like servitude from tribal warfare. This was an attempt at cultural erasure, which is why restoration, our sacred restoration as a people, has to include reclaiming those parts that were attempted to be erased, that are still being attempted to be erased, and the disconnection from that. So by her creating and bringing that concept forth, it gave us language around really understanding the broadness of what we experienced, both in our mind and in our collective memory. She encourages us that we have to preserve that collective memory and find ways to know our history so that we can forge towards liberation. We got to know where we've been. Acknowledging Ma'afa is an act of resistance and an act of restoration, and a refusal to let this trauma inflicted by colonial powers be forgotten, ignored, or erased. Don Lemon went in today. I think we're going to see more and more of folks that's on the right side of things go in unapologetically because they understand that what's at stake, and the only thing that can create the future that we all want is to stand in whatever capacity individually we each are able to stand in, but to do so without delay because we're here. So let's keep it moving. Ooh, honey. Nope. When I say nope, I'm talking about the words of this framework. But she wrote a book in 1994, or published it in 1994, and she talks about, and the name is Yurugu, and she presents this idea and this framework of how to look at European culture and how it's different, and did it was really a groundbreaking, a different analysis of European culture and the differences of it from African-centered culture. And in this book and in the research that she's done, she really looks to identify what are those structures and motivations that are at the foundation of European thought and behavior. Now, we know as Black folks, many of us have looked at them as like, damn, how do they think? Like, how can you do the things that they have done to a human being and justify it and have done so for hundreds of years? Some of the newscasters, I'm not even, I didn't even retain her name because she's not worthy of that much space in my brain. But Don Lemon was going in on this white woman today. Some of the things that have come out of her mouth, and she believed it. One of the things that she said, and Santa Claus is white. And yes, Jesus Christ was a white man. I'm like, where did you study? Like, what? Anyway, the point is, how can they possibly think the way they think? And so she went with Yurugu. She drew inspiration from the doggone myth that talks about this figure, Yurugu, who is an incomplete and eternally dissatisfied being. And she used it as a metaphor of how she perceives European culture as being incomplete and predatory. And that this cultural incompleteness, it drives this relentless quest to just control and dominate everyone else because they themselves feel incomplete. And that's manifested in colonialism, imperialism, systemic racism, racist capitalism. And further, she breaks it down into, well, the whole framework that can be applied in assessing any culture into those three words, asi, yuta mawazo, and Utah Rojo. That's the last time I'm gonna say them words. But those three components, whereas the first one, dang, I gotta say it again. Asili is the cultural seed, the core ideology that shapes a society's worldview, the origin, the essence of a culture. And it'll shape the direction of a culture's development. And Utama Wazo is a thought pattern that arises from that cultural seed, and it dictates how reality is perceived and interpreted. Culturally structured thought is another way you could think about that, dictating how members of a culture will perceive and interpret reality so that the thought patterns are in alignment with that core seed thought patterns. That's the next progression. And then the third part of that framework is the vital force or energy that drives implementing thought and behavior. It's kind of the emotional tone and motivational spirit that drives the collective behavior of a society. So in her view, the asali of European culture is characterized by themes of separation and control, a foundational essence that creates dichotomies. That means it's always one thing versus another thing, man versus nature, self versus other, thought versus emotion. And she says that these separations facilitate a worldview that legitimizes domination and exploitation because the other is dehumanized. When you have a dichotomy a dichotomous way to look at the world where it's yourself and then everybody else, you automatically, and the thought process that goes along with that is to dehumanize everybody else. And they're objectified. They only serve a means to an end. And then the driving force, according to Dr. Ani of the European culture, the driving force is one of aggression and conquest. So that culture, European culture in this case, is imperialistic in its endeavors, all from that core seed of seeing self versus other. Very different than the African core seed of seeing self as other, Ubuntu. I am you and you are me. That's a core foundational element and difference in worldview and thinking that drives everything else. So these were very compelling and powerful thoughts and ways to look at and assess what we were experiencing. We are living in a world, in a society, in an environment that is based off of a European core seed, a European cultural seed. We are living in a world that core seed has taken over the world, has done and done the work of how she described it in terms of thought process and thought process in action. Kind of how we've been talking about, especially last week with the ancestors who are of our sacred resistance ancestors. And the main underlying foundation that we found, the wisdom from all of them, to summarize all of them, they each had something a little bit different, but the summary of all of it is love, courage, action. So it's a very similar framework in terms of the categories, but what they are very different. And it's part of the reclamation of who we are as a people that's required in order for us to maintain the level of liberation that we have now and to take it further. Reclaiming who we are, love, courage, action, community, Ubuntu, we are one. Very different than the dominating culture that we are in right now, that we're living in right now. And so we thank Dr. Ani for giving us a framework, a way to think about it. It's not the only way. That's the beauty of living a life that is based on an African-centered core thought process or core belief. It doesn't have to be one or the other. There is space for different ways and different approaches. And this is one, and we thank her for doing this work, for having the bravery, for having her lived experience and her education and her courage to leave this behind for us to dig into, to understand, which is why one of the reasons I said, instead of us doing a meditation, go and find works of her speaking. Go and find other leaders talking about her and her work and actually listen to it for yourself. That's what we're learning all throughout here, is to have the critical thought. And to have critical thought, you actually have to have facts and not someone else's regurgitated or straight up lies or regurgitated processed thoughts of something else. Go and find and listen to her directly. Okay. And then, of course, I mean, the whole foundation of all of it is that she critiqued what we were just talking about, the whole world, the global impact that Europe and this European cultural and core thought and way of looking at the world has had a global impact on African identity and culture. And we say that particularly because we are talking about as Africans in the diaspora who were descendants of those who were enslaved. But we can say that this European approach, this European-centric cultural ideology has had a devastating impact on all cultures across the world. The crazy thing is that, including their own, but I'm not here to advocate for that. That's for them to figure out what they're losing by being what and who they are. And she advocated for African-centered education and intellectual sovereignty. And I look back to how she mentioned how she had her BA, which was steeped in this Western ideology at University of Chicago, and went deeper into African-centered and indigenous-centered education and thought. Having that balance enabled her to understand, oh, what they teaching us is some bull. They are teaching and perpetuating the European way of looking at everything as if, yes, as if it's the standard. And they teach it through education at all levels. But what Dr. Ani has left for us and told us and her is that we have to look at African-centered education. And what's crazy is And, no shade, you do what you gotta do. How many Africans go to Europe for education? Um, Again, do what you gotta do, but just remember who you are in the process, which, plenty have, but that's just an interesting aspect, and that's only because of colonization that that was even necessary to do in some cases, because the first universities were in Africa. I'm just saying. Okay, so let's keep it moving and talk about Miss Miriam and how she left for us and approaches her approach to this cultural reclamation. And we've already talked about her music talents and the work that she did. She really pioneered this idea of representing African sounds in contemporary ways. Like she blended traditional African sounds with contemporary genres and put a unique style that really centered African unity and African identity. There's a song, I think it's called, I mean, there's multiple names from it, Pata Pata, or basically the click song. And there's another indigenous name for it. And she introduced global audiences to that song, to that work, in understanding the variety of types of African languages and rhythms and storytelling traditions. Very difficult, but difficult to say and pronounce, and the Europeans that were colonizing them couldn't even understand it as much as they would try. And her music was really a cultural cross narrative where it affirmed Black people. It affirmed our beauty and our strength and our resilience. Again, why I say go listen to her sing this song in particular, or any of her music, any of her work, and just sit with that. Light a candle and just sit with it. Or don't like nothing, just sit with it and listen to her and let the power of her voice and those words, without even understanding the words, unless you speak the language. I mean, but just let that work for you. That's your meditation. That's your assignment after this, is to literally go, because we have the privilege of being able to hear these ancestors speak, or in her case, sing and speak in their own voices. Tap into that. Let that be transformative for you. And she also used her platform to, as we talked about, to challenge apartheid and this oppression. She was the first African artist to popularize South African music internationally. She brought attention to what was happening. And where attention flows, where energy flows, change has to happen. It couldn't keep, if it had kept going in the dark without focus, and I'm not saying she was the only one, there was a plethora of people. There's there was everyone doing the work. But she did her part in a way that you wouldn't think was about resistance. But culture absolutely is. Reclaiming and maintaining culture absolutely is. And she performed in these global venues um, and linked cultural celebration with political resistance. She confirmed music is a form of protest and education and a form of restoration. And she embodied Pan-African solidarity. Again, her collaborating, and I keep grinning whenever I say, and I think about her marriage to Kwame Ture. What was that collaboration like? What was that courting like? That's just the semi-messy of me. Or not so much messy, I'm just curious, like seeing how humans come together and ebb and flow. Had she not been exiled, would they have ever met? It's amazing. But she collaborated with a lot of artists and activists from the diaspora. Nina Simone, already mentioned, her husband, Kwame Ture, Harry Belafonte, and helped to link this whole Pan-African struggle together. And she actively supported and performed at political rallies for like Kwame Nkrumah, who we'll talk about, is that tomorrow? No, in a couple of days, later on this week. So she was highly involved and used her voice in beautiful ways to bring to help bring this movement together. Again, was part of a collective. And in doing so, in showing up how she shows up unapologetically, she helped to redefine the role of women in this political resistance. She shattered these stereotypes about African women's roles in arts and politics. I think it's tomorrow we'll talk about a prophetess, Alice, in what is now known as Zambia. And she, in a very different way, but stood up as a leader and showed resistance to colonial forces as a woman, again showing that Black women leadership in a different light. But Miriam Makeba, her life, her music, everything she did as a female cultural icon helped push us forward, helped us highlight the intersection of race, gender, and cultural identity, and how important it is to have, we've been saying this for a couple of weeks now, the critical role of Black women in liberation movements. It has to be all of us. It has to be both sides. We cannot continue to, again, claim the ideology, the cultural mindset of me versus the other, one versus the other, man versus woman, woman versus man. All of these ways of looking at dichotomies that come from a European mindset, we can no longer adopt those. We have to reject those and really look at how do we work together. And by together, I'm talking about and from a gender perspective because Black women's voices and contributions throughout many liberation movements have either been suppressed or minimized or not included at all. But when it has been included, when it has been surfaced up, and hell, when it's been centered, movements have been more effective. I'm just saying. But that was part of what she showed us. So, what is the wisdom that they left behind for us? We talked about the actual pieces that they left. They left us frameworks. They left us um, influence on contemporary movements. They left a legacy. They left a book. They left recordings. They left music. They left different ways for us to think about the culture that we are living in, and if it's even our culture, or what parts of what we're in are ours, and where did it come from? They've expanded our thought about contemporary feminist or womanist. And Miriam, which we give thanks, is a symbol of the idea of being exiled and then return and healing. The story of us. We weren't exiled, we were taken and stolen. It's the return that's going to be part of our healing. And I'm not just talking about physically returning in our case. That was what it looked like for her in symbolism. But we, part of all of this in the restoration journey that we're going through is how do we return within ourselves? But specifically, let's talk about Dr. Marimba and this idea of cultural sovereignty and decolonized thought. The whole wisdom she would leave behind for us is that liberation begins with reclaiming African-centered thought and cultural sovereignty. We've talked about that as we went through her work and her framework, very different way at the ethos, the foundation, the core of European thought process, very different than the core of African thought process. And we have to think about that and consider that and really understand how that impacts us. And how do we change that? And question, if you do a thing, am I doing that because that's a part of who I am? Or is that a legacy or a left behind or leave behind from this dominant culture that I'm in that I didn't choose to be in? That is an extension of that European thought that Dr. Ani left for us in terms of her analysis of it, the us versus them that we see still playing out today. So true liberation has to begin with reclaiming our minds, reclaiming how we think, how we view the world, which means you got to admit when some ain't yours and be able to do that work. And that's something that Dr. Franz Fanon talked about. Definitely something that, in our first day of restoration in that video, Dr. Franz Cress Welsing. And to be clear, this work, and I mentioned Dr. Ani when I was talking about Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, because Dr. Ani took that work from Dr. Welsing and took it further. Dr. Welsing was like, something ain't right about this racism. It's kind of like they are afraid that they are going to be genetically annihilated. It's a deep subconscious psychological issue that caused them to act the way they do because they understand they don't have melanin and that it's not going to survive for long. So they must dominate everyone else. Dr. Ani took that further and even broke it down to different constructs in the framework and and a core way that they thought or continue to think. It's not past tense; it continues to happen. So I just wanted to bring that back up because Dr. Welsling started and created a framework, created an approach with the ISIS papers and her work that came before that the ISIS papers expanded, and then Dr. Ani took it even further. And that's how we work with our ancestors. I mean, they knew each other. It wasn't like she was her ancestor. They knew each other, slightly different. I think they were maybe off by like 6 years in terms of age. But the point is, when we work in community, when we build off of each other's work, when we build off of ancestors' work, we take things further. But let me get back to what the wisdom actually was, this liberation beginning with reclaiming our minds, reclaiming our way of thinking, our African-centered thought, and this cultural sovereignty. And the one thing that I will say about that as well that just came to me is to be clear, we're talking about a core of thought process, a core way of looking at the world. We cannot assume that if an African person today has a certain way of thinking, that that is African thought, because the African person today has also been colonized. They have also been under the same tyranny that we have been under as descendants of those who were enslaved. Africans today are descendants and are colonized, as we all are colonized. So when we say African thoughts, we're talking about the root of African thought. What would all of this look like were it not for colonization? If Christopher Columbus and all the other crews had just stayed their asses at home. I'm just saying. And then, so the idea in terms of how do we move forward and how do we use the wisdom, the frameworks, all of the lessons that Dr. Ani left for us is that we have to deconstruct these Western ideologies and we got to reconnect with our ancestral values. We got to reconnect with our people. And what does that mean? How do we do that? Well, we reclaim African-centered thought for our healing. Engage in self-reflection and study. We've been saying this for a couple of weeks now. Critical thought. You got to actually look at things in a different way. Take some time to understand what actually happened. What is happening? What are the different African worldviews? What are the different cultures? Because just to say African is not enough. It's a whole continent. And even West African is not enough. Now there's different countries. Before the Europeans that came in and carved it up, it was different tribes. So even some of the countries that exist today are made up of multiple different tribes. A lot of the strife that we see happening today was created because of the colonizers coming in and forcing people to work together or to do things or to live in a way that's not in alignment with who they were, who their cultures were, their own practices for generations, thousands and thousands and thousands of years of how things were done. Colonizers came in and changed all of that and then create situations where there's strife. But when we look at applying Dr. Ani's framework of cultural essence, thought structure, and energy source with those names, I said I was not going to try to repeat because they are in Swahili, I think. All of that framework, use that, look at it, apply it to challenge Western ideology. Understand the framework and apply it to shit you see on the news, to shit you see happening right now on your block, in your city, in your country, in your state. We have frameworks, we have blueprints to be able to assess what is happening and break it down. And an action step you can take is to form or join study groups that's about decolonizing the mind, decolonizing education, sharing information, breaking it down, having some critical analysis of it, bringing through facts, not all of this damn opinion and lies and misinformation and disinformation that's floating around. As the administration and the robots and all of the people in who have seized the nation's capital at this point, as they work to remove any journalist, any voice, anyone who does not fall in line with the lies, having critical thinking is more important than ever. Seeking out truth and reliable resources is more important than ever. As Don Lemon was talking about earlier and continues to talk about, independent media, independent journalism, more important than ever. Because what we're going to see across social media, which we've already seen, what we're going to see in the mainstream media is complete lies, is a continuation of this European thought that continues to spread because media continues to spread it forward. The educational process and structure continues to spread it forward. So the whole point is, I'm bringing it back because I'll go off on a tangent, which I already did, is action step, learn some shit. PBS is on the chopping block. Dr. Belizaire let us know that earlier. Tune in to PBS. Tune in to Joy Reid's final show on MSNBC tonight. Today is Monday, February 24th. They have canceled her show. She was an unapologetically Black woman speaking up and speaking out, successful in what she did, value what she did was valuable. But to fall in line with the administration, they have canceled her show. So this will be her last show today. And the Win with Black Women Coalition had a call last night. And the mission for Black women for the 92%, and there was about 30,000 women on that call last night. The mission is to tune in to Joy Reid's last show and then turn the TV off. We are done with the mainstream media, just like we're done with Target and Walmart. We getting done with Amazon. That was a little bit harder, but we divesting from that too. We're doing all the things with our money and our time and our eyeballs to extract ourselves from the system that only seeks to profit from us. So we keep it moving. The other thing we can do is challenge those that internalize Eurocentrism. We've all been impacted by this thing that we live in. In my first book, From Fat, Black, and Unlovable to Beautiful, Powerful Love, one of the I call it a stereotype, but it's bigger than a stereotype, was this idea that beauty is related to its proximity to European white standards. And the way I phrased it in the book was, if you ain't white, you better be as close to Bunny DeBarge as you can be. Meaning you had to have every type of white feature that you could. And that really impacted me then. And it had taken time and a broader understanding. It took me going to a historically Black college to start to undo that. It took me being immersed and surrounded by people who looked by me like me, who affirmed me in order to undo that. And the point with this, that's just one aspect of how we can internalize that Eurocentrism. We have, all of us have some degree in multiple internalized beliefs that undermine our true African identity and our cultural pride. Whether it's having shame about having hips and a butt as a Black woman, Shame about our lips, our hair, any aspect of our physicalness, especially as Black women, has been challenged, has been disregarded, but at the same time sought after and emulated. We got to reclaim our shit and challenge these ways of thinking about ourselves that have been forced upon us. As I mentioned at the beginning, everything I do, beautiful, powerful love, this channel, the books, the coaching, everything is to help Black women to do that because I've had to do it over and over and over again. Can't stop, won't stop. So we keep it moving. So the action step we can do is to participate in or host healing circles. And I'm not talking about, well, let me be clear. I was going to say, I'm not talking about sitting around and sipping on, munching on some vegan foods and talking about how nice and beautiful it is to be Black. I'm talking about getting into deconstructing the colonial narratives. And I pause because it can be both. We need to kiki. We need to have some joy, but we also need to deal with very difficult topics and things. The kiki and the joy helps us to have the energy to go into the deep shit we need to go into. And then the kiki and the joy helps us to disperse what comes up when we go into the deep shit. The problem is with a lot of our folks, we get on the kiki and the joy and forget to do the deep shit and then forget the deep shit. So we have to know that deconstructing our own, decolonizing our own minds, deconstructing these narratives is critical piece of the growth process, is a critical piece of our sacred restoration, which is what we're working through this week. And then creating sacred spaces for cultural expression, whether it's, and we've seen a lot of this, for me, having been in Atlanta or Baltimore, even, Seattle, even though I always the crack a joke, it's like 5 Black people in Seattle, they have events and things that happen. But the idea is to have a cultural place, to have festivals, have workshops, to create places and spaces where African art, music, language, and spirituality is celebrated, is revered. Having our own spaces where we can tap into that energy and tap into our culture and remember it. Let that cellular memory get jogged, get reactivated, get electrified. Tapping into that. And when I look at that, it's not only physical spaces and places, it's digital as well, because that's the age we're in. A lot of what happened in November and that we are living through now based on digital spaces, was based on digital content, was based on voices, some real, most not real, that digital spaces were flooded with. So when we think about how we move forward in our restoration, we have to think holistically, physical and virtual, and creating sacred spaces for this expression. That's the wisdom, reclaiming our African-centered thought. And those are the ideas on how we can do that, that come from our ancestor, Dr. Marimba Ani, and we give thanks for her. Miriam Makeba. Sis was about the cultural activism, healing us in the diaspora, and she traveled the world and she did it. Her wisdom is pure and simple and just on point. Art is resistance. Creation is resistance. Culture is art, art is culture. We go on. Music, language, cultural expression, these are all powerful tools for healing, reclaiming our identity, and fighting this oppression. When we empower ourselves and our communities to heal, unite, and thrive through these ways, we actually create a legacy for future generations. And again, we've been talking about these last few weeks. We are living today the bit of freedoms that we have And I say bit because I don't know if we fully understand how unfree we actually are. But the bit of freedoms that we only have because ancestors fought and gave their lives so we could have it. If those three uprisings in the United States that we talked about last week, those three slave uprisings, enslaved Africans uprising, willing to lose their lives to fight for our freedom, to free themselves and future generations, if they had not done that, do you think the slavery would have morphed into what it is now? And I say morphed because it didn't end. They ended it on paper, but it didn't end. No, every actual, real, true historian has made it clear that put pressure, that made it unsafe, that made it inconvenient. And the reason why those three slave uprisings happened is because of the Haitian Revolution, which had happened prior. They heard about that and were inspired. Every bit of what we live today in terms of privileges, access, and freedoms was fought, bought, and paid for by the blood, sweat, and tears of our ancestors. And I bring that up now because we are ancestors of tomorrow. What the fuck we doing? What world are we creating for our great, great, great grandchildren? What are we doing to resist this exploding, desperate last attempt at global domination and oppression that we are living through right now? What are we individually and collectively doing so that our descendants can say our ancestors did that? I went off on a tangent, coming back. Okay. When things like that happen, I chalk that up to, some things just needed to be said and spirit coming through to say it. So, what do we do? How do we move forward? We reconnect with ancestral homelands and we center Black women in activism. We've been talking about centering Black women more and more and more. And we're talking about it more and more and more because it's more and more obvious that that's a missing piece, that that's a problem, that that's a major issue in the Black community and in the world at large, centering Black women, not only in activism, but period. Our leadership, our voices. And how do we apply all of this? Art and music. This can be critical and is critical, is a part of our cultural healing, is a part of our restoration. And the reason why resistance keeps coming up as we talk about restoration is because Dr. Franz Fanon, we talked about that in the first day of this restoration week. He did brilliant, brilliant thinker, brilliant, brilliant in his work. Talked about the idea, and I'm going to paraphrase, basically for an oppressed people to been violently abused and oppressed, part of them restoring their dignity is to push back violently as well. There's when you've been oppressed in this way, beaten, uh, unalived, all of the things that were slavery, that was and is what is happening. There is a catharticism that happens when you push back, when you resist. And when you resist in that way, in his case, with his approach or philosophy, was that violent resistance is a part of the healing process. It restores a part of you. Broaden that to think about resistance as a whole. The act of resisting your oppression is part of what brings you back to wholeness. So art is resistance and art is also restoration. Oh, let me go back. So the action step for the art and music as tools is to organize or attend concerts that feature local artists, that feature indigenous artists from through different languages, different African languages, different African cultures, different expressions of African culture, and really raise awareness around cultural pride and social justice issues. And cultural pride for us as descendants of enslaved Africans is a broad phenomenon, meaning it includes those who, the different cultures, tribes, music, languages from the continent, all the different aspects, because that's already a lot. Different tribes, different regions, different locations that we're all blended and a part of, but also the ancestors that lived and died in these United States of America. Were it not for their survival these last 400 years, we would not be here. We can't skip over that. We have to include all of them. The ones here in North America, the ones on the continent in Africa. And then there's some of us who we didn't all may go directly from the continent to North America. Some of us made stops in Brazil, Cuba, Haiti, and all the different places along the way. So we maybe have some ancestral stops to make in the other parts of the diaspora as well, because we're blended in ways that we will probably never fully understand because of slavery. But reconnecting and bringing that back. So the action step that you can take is um, a lot of people have gone back, literally, whether it's to Ghana in particular has really opened its doors and created opportunities for at least African Americans and probably I think Africans in the diaspora as well to come back and explore, and that can be the case in any with any of the areas, with any of the countries. But even without taking a trip, because the way airplanes are going these days, that might not even be the move, at least not for right now. Um, is to explore the history. There is so much content online, YouTube, that shows traditional dances, traditional music. All you have to do is look for it. It's there. Explore the spirituality, explore the cuisine. Don't assume you don't like something that you've never had. And if we apply Dr. Ani's thoughts and wisdom to that, to say you don't like something that is African, that is Black, that you've never experienced and never tried, explore why that is. Explore the underlying thoughts and reasons behind that. Do you have a direct experience yourself? And is that direct experience multifaceted, meaning did it just happen one time and you chalked it up? Or is there something a little bit deeper that you've taken on as your own thought process that wasn't necessarily yours? So that's the action step, is just to explore. Um, if nothing else, you can go to museums whenever there's an African related show or exhibit at the museum that's in your town, your state. Uh, you can go and visit. You can go and check that out. And then again, like I said, things online that you can check out as well. And then finally, centering Black womanhood. Now, y'all know I was gonna go there. Beautiful, powerful love. Everything I do is for Black women. And as I've said before, I could say Black women and femmes because I don't care what you were assigned at birth. If you identify as a woman now, I don't even need to put femme because you've identified as a woman. But the point is, if you are walking with and holding that feminine energy on in any capacity, even if you identify now as a man, but you still know that you have some degree of feminine energy, I'm saying we rocking together. Because until we're all free, Black women and femmes, at the intersection of race and gender, nobody is free. So as a woman, I'm not going to look at someone else who, whether they can actually give birth or not, for whatever gender assignment reason, I'm not going to look at them as something separate. I'm doing away with the Eurocentric way of looking at the world, that it has to be Black, white, this, the other, me versus somebody else. This binary way of thinking, which is, it's amazing how deeply European that is when we look at Dr. Ani's framework. Bringing it back, center Black women. The cultural resilience, the empowerment that we need is a gem that we can find as we look through and uplift Black women. When I say look through, meaning listen to the words, listen to the leadership, listen to the guidance. Center Black women leadership, center the words from Black women, and know that it's not going to look like it looks with a European. It's not going to look like it looks when white men are in leadership roles. Their version of leadership is really dictatorship. It's going to look different, but understand we were the first leaders on the planet. A Black woman gave birth to humanity. You can't get no more leadership than that. Tap into that. So the combined lessons and wisdom from Dr. Marimba Ani and Mama Miriam Makeba, who we give thanks for their works, we give thanks for their lives, we give thanks to their mamas and their mamas' mamas who birthed them, all the way back to the first mama from whom we are all birthed. We give thanks. We give thanks for their work. We give thanks for their courage. We give thanks for their help in helping us heal this collective ancestral cultural memory issue that we have. We give thanks for them reminding us that art and culture, our unique art and culture, although it was attempted and has been attempted to be stripped away from us, it still exists, it still thrives, and it is part of the key to our restoration, to our liberation, reclaiming all parts of us that was stripped away and that was lost, because it really wasn't fully lost, because the ancestors is waiting here with a basket full of it, waiting for us to claim it, which is what this whole 28 days has been about, opening up and reclaiming all of the beauty, the wisdom, the gifts, the talents, all the everything that our ancestors have for us. And finally, the creating sustainable cultural healing practices, long term, short term, things that we can do at a regular cadence individually and collectively. Because that's another wisdom from everyone this week so far with our sacred restoration is that this work of restoring ourselves, of healing our minds, our spirits, and our bodies from 500 years of oppression and tyranny and terrorism is both individual and collective. Both. We have to do your individual work, which is going to be difficult. And we have to do the collective work, which is going to be difficult. But if no one's doing their individual work, collective work is not only difficult, it's impossible. Because that means everybody's bringing their bullshit to the collective and the bullshit is spreading and not healing. So we're not going into a meditation today. Like I said at the beginning, we are going to, your homework is to look for recordings, speeches of Dr. Marimba Ani speaking about her framework, her book, her philosophy, her approach, so that you can hear her wisdom through her voice and sit with what you learned. Take notes, jot down some ideas and thoughts, or at the very first, just listen. And the same for Miriam Makeba. First, I would go and find that click song, that South African song in her native language that's so powerful that was banned. Go and find that and just listen. Let the songs, let the music, let the rhythms, let the words that are unfamiliar but somewhere maybe somewhat familiar, let that navigate and circulate in you, around you, through you. That's your meditation, because we have the privilege of being able to hear these ancestors speak for themselves. Connect with them and let them talk to you directly just by listening to their recorded words or watching them and listening to their recorded words. But we will take a couple of deep breaths before we depart and let all of this just settle in, and let us settle in and ground ourselves, because we are in some turbulent times. And restoration happens bit by bit, as well as the big chunks of things that we do. A little bit of restoration can be this deep breath that we're about to take in through our nose and out through the mouth. Let's do that again. You're going to inhale for 4, hold for 4, and exhale for 4. And take one more at your own pace, in your own way, with your own vibe. As you inhale peace and love and wholeness, and let it saturate your body. And exhale fear, tension, and separation. Thank you for being here. Thank you for doing your individual work and tapping in to do the collective work. And until next time, as always, take good care of you.